When we spend time with our loved ones, most of us live in that particular moment, not really thinking about when we will see them next, but taking for granted the idea that we will, in fact, see them again. We make plans for each day, each month, or even each year. No one really lives their life as if each moment could be their last. When Anita King had lunch with her daughter on March 27, 2020, before dropping her off at her boyfriend's house in Albuquerque, New Mexico, she could never have imagined that this would be the last time she would ever see her daughter again. This is the case of Pepita Redhair, and this is Gone in a Blink. Hey, true crime fans, I'm your host Heather, and welcome to episode 21 of Gone in a Blink. While many of the cases that we cover are kind of all over the map as far as being cases of people who have in fact had a decent amount of media coverage, other cases we work on have little to no media coverage at all. Today's case is one of those cases that unfortunately have not been given their fair share of coverage, and I want to help get this case out there to the public. Today, we are talking about the case of missing 27-year-old Pepita Redhair. There was not a lot of info that I could find while researching this case, and therefore this episode is a bit shorter than most. However, I feel that it's extremely important to share the details of the case that we do know. So if you're ready, let's jump right in. Pepita Madeline Redhair was born on August 4th, 1992. She grew up in the small town of Crown Point, New Mexico, which is located on the Navajo Nation, in a home that she shared with her mother, Anita King, and her sister, Shelda Livingston. Pepita was an active member of the Navajo Nation and had an immense love for life. She enjoyed such hobbies as skateboarding, cooking, drawing, and meeting new people. She had a job as a cashier at Hot Topic, which is basically a music apparel store, and she was attending college at the University of New Mexico in the hopes of one day becoming a teacher or an engineer. She typically spent her time between staying at her mother's house in Crown Point and spending time with her boyfriend, Nicholas K's house in Albuquerque. And this had been her living arrangement for the last 3 years leading up to her disappearance. March 27th, 2020 was just like any other day. Pepita and her mother went to lunch at the local McDonald's, and then they made the 2-hour drive to Albuquerque, where Anita was to drop Pepita off at her boyfriend Nicholas's house. Anita recalls that her daughter exited the vehicle that day, turned back to look at her mom, and said, quote, "Mom, I love you. Take care of yourself. Drive home safely," unquote. That would be the last time that Anita King would ever see her daughter. Pepita was in the habit of calling her mother every day, sometimes multiple times a day, just to check on her. She would then call her every night to say goodnight, and that was kind of their thing, the goodnight text messages. She was always in constant contact with her mother, so when Anita hadn't heard from her daughter in a few days, she really began to worry. 3 days after dropping Pepita off at her boyfriend's house, Anita texted her daughter to see if she was okay, and Pepita never responded. Anita thought this was extremely strange and not typical behavior of her daughter, so she gave it a couple days, and 2 days after Anita had first texted her daughter and received no response, she decided to text her again. This time, she got a text back, but it was not from Pepita. It was actually from a man who claimed that someone had sold him Pepita's phone. That someone was not Pepita. However, police are not saying who that individual was. This was very, very disturbing news for Anita to hear, and so she filed a police report with the Albuquerque Police Department immediately. Anita and her family were getting the runaround from police in the beginning First, the Albuquerque PD didn't even want to file the report because they said it was in the jurisdiction of the Crown Point PD, since Pepita lived there, even though she had also been living in Albuquerque with her boyfriend for the past 3 years. Then Crown Point PD told the family that it wasn't under their jurisdiction because Pepita had gone missing from Albuquerque. So Anita turned back to the Albuquerque PD, who then told her that they didn't want to classify Pepita's case as a missing persons case since she was an adult and had every right to go missing on her own accord. Eventually, after much pushback from police, the Albuquerque Police Department agreed to take her case. So basically, they were really giving her the runaround, giving the whole family the runaround. No one wanted to take this case. Everyone was giving every reason they could think of why it wasn't in their jurisdiction. And when Indigenous people go missing like this, it is very, very common for this type of thing to happen. So on April 19th, 2020, approximately 3 weeks after Pepita Redhair went missing, Nicholas K. finally filed his own missing person report with the Albuquerque PD. Despite the fact that both Pepita's mother and her boyfriend both filed separate missing persons reports, police were still very hesitant on considering her a missing person. And really, this just blows my mind that police don't take these cases more serious. The first 48 hours, as most people know, are the most critical. And when a person goes missing, and when you don't even take it serious from the beginning, think of all the precious time that is wasted. And to really put things into perspective, think of all the cases that could have potentially been solved and the lives that maybe could have been saved had the police taken their disappearances more serious. It's actually pretty devastating to think about. So according to Nicholas K., he and Pepita had gone out for a drink on the night of her disappearance. He states that they ended up at another male friend's house to hang out, and after getting into an argument with Pepita, she walked out of the residence and headed out on foot. He claims that he received a phone call from her the following day telling him that she was with another man. He said that he assumed it was the man they had been with the night before, and he also states that he hasn't heard from her since. Pepita's mother, Anita, says that her daughter told her on more than one occasion that her relationship with Nicholas was toxic and that he would drink excessively and turn physically violent towards her. Nicholas maintains his innocence to this day. However, he refuses to cooperate with the investigation. Anita is adamant that her daughter would never have run away without notifying her family, and she believes her disappearance has something to do with the abuse that she endured at the hands of Nicholas. In May of 2020, Anita drove to Albuquerque to collect Pepita's personal belongings from Nicholas's house. She has not heard from him since that day. Anita drove back to her home in Crown Point and placed Pepita's belongings in her childhood bedroom in the hopes that Pepita will one day come home. Anita, Pepita's sister Shelda, and many other family members continue to search for Pepita on their own, printing out missing persons flyers and passing them around the city of Albuquerque. They also searched the vicinity of Pepita's boyfriend's home several times in the hopes of finding any clues that could lead them to her, but unfortunately, they found nothing. It was reported that in May of 2020, Pepita may have been spotted in Albuquerque panhandling on 2nd Street and Freeway. However, this sighting has not been confirmed by police. Still, Anita has not given up on looking for her daughter, although there have been many delays in the investigation, one of which was the COVID-19 pandemic that prevented law enforcement from conducting in-person interviews with potential witnesses. Anita King has tried to remain strong since her daughter's disappearance. She has a very hard time staying focused, and for her, the nighttime is the hardest time. Anita's husband has since passed away, never getting the closure that the family has so desperately been seeking. A year after Pepita Redhair's disappearance in October 2021, Anita, along with other family and friends of Pepita's, attended a rally in Albuquerque to help raise awareness for Pepita's disappearance. Also attending this rally were other families whose loved ones have been missing or murdered, and to bring attention to the staggering increase in the numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women over the last several years. According to the U.S. Department of the Interior Indian Affairs, statistics show that approximately 1,500 American Indian and Alaskan Native missing persons have been entered into the National Crime Information Center throughout the U.S., and approximately 2,700 cases of murder and non-negligent homicide offenses have been reported to the federal government's Uniform Crime Reporting Program. According to an article published by the Washington Post, in New Mexico, the state has recorded the highest number of cases involving missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in the U.S. In 2019, Governor Michelle Grisham signed the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Task Force Act, which is used to study and provide solutions to help in the crisis. It was reported that of the 92 missing persons cases involving American Indian or Alaskan Native persons that the task force identified over a 5-year period, only 5 of those cases have been solved. And that's insane. That is such a small number compared to the number that go missing and or murdered every single day. Data shows that the Navajo Nation has the greatest number of missing persons cases, and these numbers continue to grow. According to an article published in the U.S. News and World Report, activists have demanded that authorities begin paying attention to the alarming number of missing and murdered Indigenous women whose cases are all too often being overlooked or ignored by law enforcement. In more recent years, it seems they are finally seeing some change, with several states with significant Native American populations such as New Mexico, Arizona, Washington, and Minnesota all launching task forces of their own in order to tackle this epidemic and place this issue on the forefront where it belongs. Research director for Amnesty International USA, which is a human rights group, said it best. She says, quote, "Indigenous women, they're subjected to a version of justice that is completely different from anybody else. Many of these cases slip through the cracks. Everybody spends hours arguing over who has the responsibility to do the primary investigation, and meanwhile, days, weeks, months have passed without someone conducting the most basic investigation," unquote. The OVC, which is the Office for Victims of Crime, spoke with 3 advocates for missing or murdered Indigenous people. Nicole Matthews is the executive director for the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. Ingrid Cumberledge is the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons Coordinator for the U.S. Attorney General's Office for the District of Alaska. And Christina Rose is the director for the Office for Victims of Crime within the U.S. Department of Justice. There is a clip from the OVC website entitled "Missing or Murdered Indigenous People, Bringing Loved Ones Home." Here is that clip.
I see the faces of the women who haven't come home yet. Looking at, the impact of violence in our communities and the high rates of sexual violence, domestic violence, the high rates of trafficking, and the intersections with poverty and racism, and homelessness and all of the things that make this issue, more challenging to address.
This is not just an Alaska Native and American Indian issue. This is a people issue.
There isn't just one story.
We had a young man in my community who was just amazing. And then at some point just disappeared. And they found him a year later in the flats.
Every day.
And we don't know what happened. We certainly don't know the circumstances, but there was serious suspicion of trauma and other things that may have happened. But every story's like that.
The reality is it can happen to any of us. These are important members of our community. These are our relatives, our mothers, our grandmas, our sisters, our aunties. This is not about something that the victim did. This is not about poor lifestyle choices. This is about a decision that the perpetrator made to cause harm to another individual.
How do we heal?
Healing comes when we have culturally specific tribal strategies to address healing.
Bringing families into a place where they're back to healing and communities into a place where they're back to healing.
The Office for Victims of Crime is a federal agency that's dedicated to ensuring healing and justice for victims of all crimes.
Our perpetrators are coming from many different populations. We needed to have a venue where we could listen to tribes and we could hear what were the missing and murdered Indigenous person stories in their communities.
We have an obligation to work as hard as we can to make sure that the voices of tribal communities are heard and that we continue to listen.
The tribes came with incredible, heart-wrenching stories, but they also came with solutions and needs.
We need more coordination with law enforcement. On reservations, our jurisdiction is very complicated.
There are 229 tribes in the state of Alaska, and they cover an area of over 600,000 acres, which literally equates to about 20% of the continental U.S. Most of them are only reachable by plane or by boat. We have 80 communities that are just listed as having no law enforcement whatsoever. We're waiting hours, sometimes days, for somebody to show up.
There's so much more to do. When a loved one is murdered or missing, it doesn't just impact the loved ones of that victim. It impacts entire communities. This trauma just doesn't go away.
When something happens, we're going to respond and we're going to report it. And we're going to stand up and say it's not okay.
And now in Minnesota, a huge win is that we have the first ever missing and murdered Indigenous relatives office in our state government. It's permanent funding. It will not go away.
People are talking to each other. People are discussing these issues. They are solving problems with each other.
We have heard from Indigenous women that they want services by Native women and for Native women. They need to know that they can come to us and that we are a safe space for them.
We've expanded our guidance so that we can provide the assistance that the families and loved ones of missing and murdered Indigenous people need, whether or not it's been determined that a crime has occurred.
It gives me hope to see our state, tribal, federal people that are responding to this issue.
What gives me hope is that I know that change is possible.
This job has been all about hope. The relationships that we've developed, the ability to have these conversations has been so important.
Working together and working hand in hand with our tribal partners, we will be able to put in place the change that needs to happen.
We have an incredible group of people coming up behind us who are going to keep pushing this.
And it really comes down to resilience. Our tribal people were incredibly resilient.
That always gives me hope.
Pepita Redhair is a Native American female who went missing from the northeast Albuquerque area on March 27, 2020. She is 5 foot 1 inches tall, and weighs 141 pounds with brown hair, brown eyes, and 2 small moles on her chin and a scar on her left eyebrow. She was last seen wearing a black shirt and black shoes. She has the following tattoos: a dinosaur on her right forearm, a koi fish or dinosaur on her left forearm, a butterfly on her shoulder, a moon with lightning on her left leg, and her last name, Redhair, elsewhere on her body. She is an active member of the Navajo Nation. If you have any information on the whereabouts of Pepita Redhair, please contact the Albuquerque Police Department at area code 505-768-2020. Thank you for listening to another episode of Gone in a Blink. Please consider following us on any of our social media sites. You can check us out on Facebook at Goneinablink or on Instagram at Goneinablinkpod. And if you have an idea for a show, or you or someone you know has a loved one whose cases you'd like us to cover, please feel free to drop us an email at goneinablinkpod@gmail.com. And last but certainly not least, please remember, be safe, be smart, and try not to blink.